Hey everyone, I've been thinking lately about kind of left wing movements throughout history and also absolutism, and how I believe at one point in history absolutism was more left wing. Because, which sounds kind of weird because you think, oh, an absolutist monarchy is like the most right wing position ever, which in today's context it is, but during like the late Middle Ages and then going to the Renaissance, I think it was more left wing because at that point you had kings now wanting to not rely on a feudal warrior class or a feudal aristocracy that could rebel against them at any point. They didn't want to rely on that, and they knew they couldn't really trust them, so they needed a counterweight, and that counterweight was the lower gentry, the yeomen, the middling yeomen farmers who weren't peasants, who they were not peasants. They owned their own land and they were making money. They were like professionals and merchants as well as artisans. So having a large kind of growing kind of middle class of professionals and relying more on that as well as a professional, well-paid army instead of the feudal way of getting soldiers, right? So I think in that sense that to me what is left wing is something that's new that replaces the old order. Like that's to me what is truly leftist. So in a sense that these centralized monarchies of both France and England replacing the old feudal structure and becoming more reliant on a more middling class. That to me is leftist because it's replacing the old feudal structure. And let me give some examples. Like, look at France for instance, like with like the Valois, the Bourbons, and all that. France used to be, yes, the kingdom has always relatively been pretty large, but throughout history, the kings didn't really have like a whole lot of control over their lords. I mean, their lords were pretty rebellious. I mean, look at the Hundred Years of War and the Dukes of Burgundy, who allied with the English, right? So, but after that, and when you get into like the Bourbons and all that, it becomes more and more of a centralized state, and it finally ends with the French Revolution, which was like one of the most centralized states ever, right? You look at England, and because of the Black Death, and it killed so many of the peasantry and just so many fucking people. Now that, in a twisted kind of way, it created a lot of opportunities for the peasantry. You know, since okay, if all your like relatives died and they all owned like 1 or 2 acres, and you were the only one left, and you gained their land, well, now you have more land, and now you can make more money, right? So in England, you had the rise. Because of that, you started to have the rise of the yeomanry, the yeoman class. A good example of the yeoman is the English longbowman, who isn't a peasant, but he isn't like gentry. He isn't man at arms. You know, he can afford a horse. He's a longbowman, and he owns his own land. So with the rise of the yeomen, the rise of the merchants, the rise of the artisans, is like, and just generally, like kings are now like thinking, like I don't want to be reliant on this feudal aristocracy, because this feudal aristocracy throughout history was creating so many problems, so many rebellions, as well as like wanting a more well-paid military, like a standing army. So that's just more examples of a push towards centralization. And you can look at it with the English Civil War and the two factions. You had the Lancasterians and the Yorkists, who are both branches of the Plantagenets. But the Lancasterians were more of the old guard, you know, the upper gentry, feudal whatever, right? But when you look at the Yorkists, their policies are more pushing for a growing, I guess, in some ways, a growing middle class, a allying with the English merchants, the yeomen as well. So I guess a sort of slightly more progressive faction if you compare the Yorkists and Lancasterians. And then finally, which is ironic, uh, when the House of York was overthrown by the House of Tudor, and when Richard III died and Henry Tudor took control and he became Henry VII, the House of Tudor adopted a lot of the Yorkist policies of centralization, of basically kind of neutering the aristocracy so they could remain in power. So I think at a point in history, I would consider absolutism a left as being leftist at one point in history. Not anymore. Now it's very much a right wing position, but at a certain point in history, I consider it leftist.